Sorry about that, everybody. We had some sound issues, so we're going to start again as if nothing happened. Hi, I'm Marcus Fayers, founder and editor-in-chief of Dezeen, and I'm broadcasting live from Dezeen's studio space in London. Today we've teamed up with surface material distributor CDUK to discuss biophilic design and sustainable materials. The talk coincides with the launch of PaperStone, a new recycled sustainable material which is available through CDUK. And I'm here with Oliver Heath, who's a biophilic designer. Hi, Oliver.
Hi, Marcus.
Oliver, first question obviously is, what is a biophilic designer?
Well, a biophilic designer is essentially someone who tries to enhance the human connection with nature in the buildings. It's a form of human-centered design that looks predominantly at health and well-being and then kind of focuses in and zeroes in on this aspect of our connection with nature and the many benefits it can bring to the built environment.
And is there more to biophilic design than simply putting plants in interior spaces? Is there more science to it than that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously when we talk about enhancing that connection, people immediately kind of think, oh, it's about bringing plants and trees and greenery in. That is, of course, one bit of it. You know, it's a very rich, multi-sensory quality, and it has many psychological effects. But actually, beyond that, there are many other what we call patterns, which are features of biophilic design. And actually, the godfather of biophilic design, Stephen Kellett, had 73 different attributes of biophilic design. So it goes beyond just these real elements of nature, and it kind of moves into this area of kind of what we call indirect references to nature, which is how we mimic it, using natural materials and colours and textures, but also about the sort of quality of spaces. Essentially, it's an evolutionary design ethos.
And is it a new thing?
No, I mean, you know, this idea has been around since we first existed in nature. How long have we known about it?
But they weren't calling it biophilic design back then, were they?
No, they weren't. No. But of course, they recognised the need for nature for basic human survival, and that is what we always reference. So this idea was kind of first recognised back in the 1980s, popularised by the psychologist Edward O. Wilson, who recognised society's departure away from rural dwellings and into city centres, and the many physiological and psychological problems that started to happen. I mean, you could say that the issues started to kind of become most apparent at the birth of the Industrial Revolution, when people moved away from agrarian dwellings and into city centres.
And we're hearing a lot about biophilic design now. I mean, why is that? Why now? Why is it such a buzzword these days?
I think for the very simple reasons that we are experiencing a climate crisis and biodiversity loss, and a sudden recognition that human survival is kind of dependent on our connection with nature that supplies so many of the things that we need to support it, being, you know, clean air, food, water. So there are kind of physiological but also psychological requirements for us to be connected to nature.
And you're going to give us a presentation in just a minute about biophilic design and your work. But first of all, tell us a little bit more about you. What do you do? Who are you? What's your background?
So I run a design company down in Brighton called Oliver Heath Design. We're a group of kind of researchers and designers who undertake kind of all different aspects of biophilic design, essentially trying to kind of enhance the uptake of the movement, to educate people, but also to implement it. So we have a group of researchers who collate knowledge and research. We write white papers. We've just released a book called Design a Healthy Home. We also have a design department where we implement some of that knowledge. And then I spend a lot of my time talking to architects and designers across Europe, Scandinavia, the Middle East and the Far East about health and well-being in the built environment.
Well, that's a good cue for you to show us your presentation.
Lovely. Okay. Thank you very much. So hopefully we're live and you can see my slides now. So very often when we talk about sustainable design, it tends to kind of become a very carbon-centered conversation. You know, we're often talking about embedded carbon and in-use carbon, and in a way that's the kind of metrics that we know about sustainability. But what we're now seeing is a movement away from carbon-centered design and a recognition of the role that human-centered design plays, and in particular looking at the role of health and well-being. And that's exactly the subject I'd like to talk to you about today, with a particular focus on this area of biophilic design, which is how we enhance the human connection to nature in the buildings that we live and work in. As I just mentioned to you, Marcus, a lot of our work is actually about collating knowledge and research. And one of the really interesting things about biophilic design is that it's an evidence-based approach to design. So there's 30 years of psychological analysis, research studies that demonstrates many of the different attributes of biophilic design and what happens when we bring it into the built environment. So we collate those, we write white papers for all different sorts of organizations, we write strategies, for helping organisations to implement those ideas into their buildings. And then also we implement those in our own designs. So with the birth of this new movement, it's very much about, how do we translate these psychological studies into three-dimensional realities? And then I spend, of course, a lot of my time traveling the world, teaching people about this idea, hopefully demonstrating that it's a kind of framework of ideas that they can implement in their own style for their own particular clients. So why now? Why is biophilic design becoming so important? Well, you could say that actually our relationship with nature is broken. And we're seeing this in so many different aspects of our lives. We're seeing it in the way that we use basic resources and our energy systems, the way we treat fauna and flora, our transport systems, and even our food systems. The microbiomes in our stomach, we don't even look after those. So what we're now starting to see is the impact of this sort of disrespect for nature in our climate crisis and biodiversity breakdown. And we're also seeing this, of course, in the way that we treat all the materials in our lives in this very linear system of kind of make, use, and throw into a hole in the ground. And what we need to be transitioning towards is a much more circular economy approach. Now, this isn't just about the kind of the physiological impact. Our relationship with nature is really important for our well-being. And actually, in our 24/7 lifestyles, our disconnection with nature is leading to, I think, very high levels of stress across many different building typologies. Added to that, we have very high rates of urbanization. By 2050, 68% of the world will be living in urban spaces. 90% of the UK lives in cities. And actually, we spend 90% of our lives indoors. So, of course, the spaces we surround ourselves in are going to have a very big impact on our physical and mental well-being. Added to that, we've got a lot of technology in our lives. So that can be very distracting. We can be having a conversation, or we can be working and immediately then go onto our phones, our laptops. And it basically means we've always got this sense of directed attention. We don't give ourselves the opportunity to stop, reflect, restore and recuperate, as we have done for hundreds of thousands of years. And I think that can be very damaging to many of the buildings that are so important in our lives. Now, if I was to ask you to think of a space where you felt most happy, calm and relaxed, the chances are you'd think of a space surrounded by nature. You probably would see a pool of water, maybe trees and greenery. And this is important because, when we think of spaces that make us feel good, we tend to kind of gravitate towards this idea of nature. And in a way, lots of the kind of ideas behind biophilic design explain why, when we feel most stressed and we decide to take a holiday, we head for the beaches, the mountains and the forests. And when we're in these spaces, we feel good again. The stress washes away, we sleep better, we have better conversations. Nature has this incredible ability to make us feel better. The problem is really that our cities don't allow for that. So why is this? How do we explain this phenomenon? Well, I believe a lot of this is down to what we call biophilia. And biophilia, as I mentioned, means a love of nature. And it explains humans' innate attraction to nature and to natural processes. Now, this is an idea that was first developed in the 1980s and picked up and popularized, it was picked up initially by Erich Fromm, who was a social psychologist, and then developed by Edward O. Wilson, who popularized the idea, who recognized society's departure away from rural dwellings and into city centres, and the many physiological and psychological problems that came from us surrounding ourselves with the built environment. These ideas were then picked up by the likes of Stephen Kellett, who translated this desire to be in and around nature into a series of patterns, a series of ideas that we can pick up and bring into the natural or the built environment to, in a way, soften off those harder edges, to create spaces where we don't just survive, but we also thrive and flourish. So, as I mentioned, biophilic design is an evolutionary design ethos. It recognizes that as human beings, we've spent 99.5% of our time in healthy forms of nature for our basic human survival. When we think about the spaces that we were looking for, even then we were looking for spaces to kind of protect us from the environment, to provide warmth and shelter, somewhere we can have a fire, cook food, this kind of need to create spaces where people can come together and act as communities. Really human beings haven't developed very, very much since that point. And actually our development, our human development in the natural world has formed our senses, and that plays an enormous role in how we experience the world and how we can make it better. So there's an interesting idea built on this idea called the savanna hypothesis. And what it suggests is that when we have access to healthy forms of nature and we can look out over these spaces from a point of safety, it has the ability to reduce heart rates and blood pressure levels. Simply put, when we look over spaces filled with healthy forms of nature, be that water and trees and bushes and greenery, when we can see there are opportunities, whether that's sort of prey, and we can see potential threats such as predators, when we have lots of natural light flooding down, and we can see all of this from a point of safety or prospect, it makes us feel good and safe. And lots of the ideas of biophilic design are kind of wrapped up in this kind of very utopian vision of the spaces that make us feel good and happy. The problem is, of course, is that, as I said, 90% of the UK lives in built-up, urban, noisy, geometric spaces. So how do we translate these ideas of the savanna hypothesis into our built environment? Well, that's exactly where biophilic design steps in. Now, there are three key core principles to biophilic design. The first is the direct connection to nature, and this is how we bring real sensory forms of nature into the built environment. And it is, as we've mentioned, trees and greenery, but it's also things like water, natural light, fresh air. It might be about those slow changes that we see over the seasons in the materials or in that landscape and how nature grows and develops. The second is what we call an indirect reference to nature, and it's how we mimic or evoke a feeling of nature using natural materials, colours, patterns, textures and shapes, and even technologies. And for me, this is a really interesting area for designers. And the third is what we call the human spatial response. And this is how we create spaces that nurture us and support us. So it might be about the creation of spaces where we can sit and relax and recuperate our mental and physical energy. But it's also about how we create exciting and stimulating spaces, spaces where we're able to work, to focus, to mix, mingle and cohabit, and to create exciting spaces that we ultimately want to be in. Now, one of the approaches to biophilic design is called the 14 Patterns of Biophilic Design, developed by an American company called Terrapin Bright Green. Now, within this, there are these 14 patterns, and what we have is 7 elements in the direct connection, including connection to nature, non-visual connection, so it's about how we use the other senses. It's something called non-rhythmic sensory stimuli, which is about that subtle sense of movement we see in nature, thermal airflow and variability, the presence of water, dynamic and diffuse natural light, and also connections from natural systems that change over time. In that indirect reference, we have something called biomorphic forms, which essentially is how we mimic the shapes we find in nature, like, let's say, a column that looks like a tree. The material connection to nature is how we bring natural materials in. And also what we call complexity and order. It's how we bring visual richness that reminds us of the natural hierarchy of pattern and texture we find in nature. And in the human spatial response, we've had these ideas of prospect, which is about being able to see out and over a landscape or a space from a point of safety. Refuge, which is about having somewhere just to sit and recuperate. Mystery, which is about creating excitement and stimulation, encouraging people to go and explore. And peril, which sounds a little bit dangerous, but actually it's more about creating excitement and a rush of adrenaline that creates exciting and stimulating spaces. Now, unfortunately, I don't really have time to go into all of these in more detail, but some of the ideas that I think are really important and are going to be important for designers over the next decade is how we mimic and evoke a feeling of nature using what we call indirect connections. Now, what's interesting is that indirect connections aren't as multi-sensory as, say, standing in the middle of a forest or surrounded by trees and greenery and fresh air. But actually, what the research shows and demonstrates is that even simulated natural environments can facilitate stress relief. Now, stress is an enormous factor in the ability for buildings to function as they're intended. Stress causes unnecessary costs like absenteeism, presenteeism, and staff turnover. But actually, if we reduce stress, it can help to improve outcomes, things like productivity, creativity, and connection and engagement with organizations. So it's important to recognize the role that this artificial element of nature really plays in those 3 core principles. So one interesting idea is the use of fractal patterning. Now, fractals are naturally reoccurring patterns that slightly change. then in a way they replicate themselves at different scales with subtle variations. And interestingly, what the studies show is that they can lower our psychological stress levels by up to 60% just by having biophilic fractal patterning. It could be through the introduction of plants and greenery or even images of nature. Another really interesting study showed, and this is replicated by studies all over the world, is that students who studied in classrooms with solid timber walls have reduced heart rates of 8,600 beats per day. So literally, our choice of surface materials can facilitate physiological improvements in our well-being. Now, as I mentioned, one of the interesting things about biophilic design is that it's an evidence-based approach. So we've got all these studies that show that that connection to nature can reduce costs, negative costs, but improve outcomes for both people, productivity and planet across a whole range of different building sectors. So studies have shown that when we introduce elements of nature into education spaces, it can have all sorts of fantastic improvements. So when natural light alone is improved, there's a 20 to 26% improvement in the increase in the speed of learning. Absenteeism can be reduced, and there's a 5 to 14% improvement in test scores just when we improve that connection to natural light. In healthcare scenarios, when patients have views onto trees and greenery, it's shown that actually they can recuperate 8.5% faster and with nearly 22% less medication. And incredibly, actually patients feel less stress when they're looking at nature and onto greenery. And actually, when even images of nature are found in hospitals, it has the ability to improve occupant experience. And in hospitality, well, in a way, the ideas of connecting nature and hospitality spaces is already intertwined. We know that if we're going to book the best room with the best view, we're going to pay a little bit more. But what the studies show is that actually guests are prepared to pay 23% more with a better view. Generally, that's onto nature. And actually, guests will spend 36% more time in a hotel lobby when it's got biophilic features. So elements of nature, natural light and water. So it's good for us because it helps reduce stress. It's also clearly good for business. And that's replicated in the biophilic design in retail spaces research, which shows that actually when elements of nature are introduced, there's an increase in dwell time, so people spend longer in retail spaces with elements of nature. Customers, actually it changes their perception of the value of goods. So actually when the elements of nature are around, goods look like they're more valuable and more expensive. And it also increases the rates of turn. And I think this is really important for our ailing high streets, not to simply be spaces where people are encouraged to go and spend money, but also encouraged to go and hang out, relax and enjoy time with friends and family. In the workplace, I think this is really important because we can most accurately measure the true benefit of biophilic design in the workplace. Again, multiple research studies have shown that when elements of nature are available in our workplaces, there's an increase in well-being by 15%, productivity goes up by 6%, creativity up by 15%, there's an increase in the performance of mental function and memory recall by between 10 and 25%, and also reduction in absenteeism. So again and again, we're just seeing these amazing results. Now in the home, it's kind of a little bit more tricky because we're not trying to measure things like productivity or creativity or engagement. But actually what the research does show is that when elements of nature are available in neighbourhoods, there is an increase in property value by 7% and also a reduction in crime between 7 and 8%. So essentially, when we bring nature in, people feel more relaxed, less stressed, they're more likely to connect with neighbourhoods, so there's an enhancement of that sense of community by having natural features that give people the opportunity to connect. So that's some of the research studies that we've been collating. And I just want to show you a couple of little case studies where we've implemented these ideas. This first project is for a project called the Hackney School, just up the road from here. And essentially this is a school for autistic children. This was a forgotten room off a playground. It was just being used as a dumping ground. What the teachers told us was that the children were feeling very stressed and exhausted by being in the playground. They were overwhelmed and they wanted a place where the children could go relax and restore. So this was the shape of the space. It was probably the smallest project we've ever done. This is a little wedge-shaped space. And essentially what we did is we introduced basic patterns of biophilic design, but because of the level of autism of the students, we weren't able to introduce any plants. They were too fascinated by them, and so the children would sort of strip them apart. So we had to rely on those indirect references to nature. And you'll see what we did here. So we created some little niches, We work with Interface, the carpet manufacturers, to kind of line the floors with biomimetic flooring that mimics nature. We also line these little hexagonal niches with that carpeting as well. And that actually improved the acoustics in those spaces. So when the children walked in, they immediately jumped into these little hexagons. And you'll see some of that kind of the pattern and texture and the materiality of the project here. You'll see the window seats that allow the children to look out onto the playground and have that sense of prospect. So they weren't surrounded by the chaos and the noise of that space, but they could look out and observe it from a point of safety. And opposite those window seats, you can see they've got the niches, but also in the far end, a little cause and effect interactive system. Again, in this image, you can see some of the materials we use, the biomimetic flooring, the natural wallpaper from Scandinavia. And in the far end, you can see those little interactive features. So the point about this was that we wanted children to engage with nature in a more sensory way. So each of these is a push pad. When they touch one of the pads, whether it's the one with the grass or the pebbles, the shells or the leaf, what happens is a light changes color, and there's also a sound effect that comes out. So when you press one, let's say with the pebbles, you hear the seashore. With the leaves, you hear the leaves blowing through the wind. So you get these kind of like changing acoustic landscapes. And just the second project I wanted to show you, this was a project called the Biophilic Design in the Workplace study at the Building Research Establishment in Watford. What we did is we worked with the BRE to transform one of the spaces in their campus. Essentially, we took this building here. It was a 1980s concrete frame building, hadn't really had anything done to it since the 80s. So in a way, the building had settled down, but there was actually, hadn't had anything done to it, and the people in the building weren't that happy with it. Now, what we did is we carried out what we call a pre-occupancy evaluation. So I mentioned this research need in biophilic design, this evidence-based approach. So in this study, what we did is we looked at a number of different factors and we measured them across an entire year. And interestingly, what that research study showed was that actually indoor air quality was technically okay. Everything had off-gas, there weren't toxins in the environment. The acoustics were kind of okay, they weren't terrible, they were fine. And also the lighting was okay. There was lots of natural light coming in and the lighting fittings were okay. So lots of things that you could measure, like literally put a number to, seemed to be all right. But interestingly, this study was both a quantitative study, so we measured the numbers, but also a qualitative study. So we spoke to people and what they said was dramatically different to how the building measured. People basically found that the building lacked imagination. It wasn't somewhere they were proud of. They didn't want to bring people back to it. They weren't happy with the space at all. So there was this sort of glaring disparity between the numbers that we evaluated from the space and the way people felt about it. And we used this research to essentially enhance the brief that we created for the space. Now, unfortunately, at this point, the pandemic hit and the whole of the approach to the built environment estate at the BRE changed. Our project was switched over to a much smaller space. So we then were given another space to kind of transform. So this is a BIM model of that space. And so a few images here as well of that building and what we actually created initially. And then our ideas were switched into this other space. So this is another building on the BRE campus. And essentially the ambition for this biophilic foundation space was to implement a series of biophilic features and knowledge within the space, working with a series of core partners, bringing direct elements of nature with plants and greenery and natural light, indirect references with natural materials and colours and textures, and also that sense of human spatial response. And here are some of the images, the kind of drawings that we created for that space, and a few images of the space that we've just completed a couple of weeks ago. You see the green wall by Biotexture, natural timber on the floor, natural timber on the walls. We've got biomimetic carpeting by Interface, greenery and desks by Wallman Lighting and Royal Irons Furniture, and then a number of other kind of features such as images on acoustic panels by the Journal of Biophilic Design and Ecofon. So it's been a really interesting project looking at how we can implement biophilic design and a desire to try and investigate what we call the return on the investment. So I'm just going to leave you with this idea. This idea is basically what we call the nature diet triangle. And it's based on the food diet triangle. And essentially what it suggests is that when we think about nature and our immersion to it, connection to it, isn't something that we should just experience once a year when we go on holiday, but it's something that we should try and integrate into our lives across every month, every week and every day. And not just at a city-wide level, or a national level, it should be something that we think about at all different scales, from the national approach to the city approach. Think about how we bring nature into our neighbourhoods, into our streets, our buildings, into our interiors, and also bring that thinking into every piece of furniture. Because essentially what we need to be asking ourselves is, how much nature do we need every day to make us feel good, to help support our physical and mental well-being, which we know it can do? And also, what constitutes a healthy portion of nature? So I think it's this kind of intriguing model. So if you'd like to learn more about biophilic design, we've written lots of white papers that are free to download on creating positive spaces using biophilic design, the benefits of it to enhancing communities, and you can download that there at interface.com. And they've been our knowledge partners supporting our research. And also we've just written a book called Design a Healthy Home, which has just come out with DK. So that's an introduction to health and well-being in the built environment. So that's basically it. This idea of biophilic design is, I think, for me, really interesting. Being evidence-based, it's very different to a lot of the other design styles that we've had. And there are multiple benefits. Of course, there are benefits for us as in the design community, because we have evidence to base our kind of our proposals on. There are benefits for building occupants who get to experience a better quality of life. Benefits for our clients who see reduced costs and improved outcomes. And of course, there is a benefit to the wider natural environment, because when we understand that our health and well-being is intrinsically linked to the health and well-being of our natural world, that it leads us to a greater desire for the conservation of our natural environment. Biophilic design is an essential component in the creation of happier and healthier places to live and work, because it's better for people, it's better for productivity, and it's better, ultimately, for the planet.
Great, thank you very much. I was very interested when you were talking about simulated environments and artificial nature. So is the key to it to make people think that there's nature around them rather than there actually be nature? You can trick them into thinking they're in a natural environment through technology or even plastic plants?
Essentially, it is. I mean, it's about kind of recognizing that being in nature makes us feel good. So it's about drawing on those experiences and bringing it into spaces. Of course, many of the plants that we bring into buildings are tropical plants, so we don't tend to find them in our local environment, particularly not in England. You may if you were living in Singapore. So what we're essentially trying to do is create a feeling of nature. And by referencing that and bringing elements of nature in, but also natural movement and recognizing the impact that things like natural light has, it's about kind of drawing on those reference points of our experiences to nature and using those reference points to reduce stress and to aid physical and mental recuperation, and maybe even draw people together to create a stronger sense of community.
And you could argue that the whole history of architecture, of interior spaces, is to protect people from scary stuff, i.e. nature, roof over the head to keep the rain out, walls to keep the bugs and the wild animals out, a fire to scare off saber-toothed tigers and things like that. So is the interior environment actually a place where nature should be welcome? Maybe the nature should be outside the interior?
Well, I think that's a good point. And I think initially, as kind of like early dwellers of forms of architecture, there was a close connection to nature, from the kind of interior surfaces, from the inclusion of fire, from the views looking out of spaces. And then slowly our architecture has become ever more exclusive of the natural world. And in a way, it's treated the natural world as rather dirty and dangerous, and created these relatively pristine, machine-like aesthetics that completely disconnect us from the natural world. But ultimately what we end up with is kind of hermetically sealed, sensorially deprived white cube boxes. Now, if I was to put you in a white box, white floors, white walls, a white ceiling with a glow of light, you might initially think, well, this is amazing, this is great. But how long before you recognize that you had complete sensory deprivation and you crave some form of visual texture, some sensory haptic texture, some form of nature to start to soften that space off? If you go back to that kind of basic machine-like aesthetic, is that something that's actually a positive? And slowly we start to say, well, if we are going to be bringing in natural colors, materials, textures, elements of nature, how do we do that? And a lot of our work is about trying to measure, what is the right amount or level of nature to bring in to essentially bring a return on investment.
I remember the first time I went into a hotel room and the TV was on with a kind of crackling log fire movie thinking it was really, really weird because it was an air-conditioned white room on the 10th floor in Vienna or something like that. But I could understand the instinct was to make you feel that there was some kind of connection with an old way of living that involved natural materials.
Yeah, there is another idea, actually. As I mentioned, it's this idea of non-rhythmic sensory stimuli. A lot of our interior spaces are very static, and they're very hard and geometric, diametrically opposite, really, to our experiences in nature. If you position yourself in a wildflower meadow, and you see those beautiful movements of the kind of gentle sway of reeds and flowers and grasses, and the movement of the trees in the distance, and the gentle movement of the clouds overhead, all this sort of subtle movement creates what we call a soft fascination. Literally kind of changes the air of your brain. It relaxes you. It's very calming and restorative. So I suspect, when we mimic nature with these artificial references, as you mentioned, with, an artificial log fire or even a fish tank, it's about bringing some reference point back to natural movement into the built environment to reference point it, but also just give you something to look at, to create that sense of soft fascination, that gaze, and that kind of semi sort of randomized, chaotic movement that is ultimately quite safe and nurturing.
And I guess it's not just about visual stimulus as well. It's the fireplace. The interesting thing about the fireplace in the hotel room was the crackling sound, the kind of, what you described it as arrhythmic or something
non-rhythmic, sensory stimuli.
Yeah, and then the smell of nature. It's quite easy to bring odor inside, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, when I think back to my favourite nature experiences, it's often sitting around a log fire, and you think about how rich that experience is. You're looking at this wonderful flickering flame. You see the glow of the embers. You can hear the crackle of the logs. You can smell the burning of the timber, and you feel the warmth. And if you're sitting around a campfire, maybe you drink a glass of wine, and it's amazing what it does to you. Actually creates a very, very different sense of being. And I think, sometimes these sort of shared experiences can have a very connecting effect. And I'm really interested in this way that nature can be what we call socio-psychological. It's not just about kind of making us individually feel better, a neuroscientific approach, but can also connect us with a particular moment, a place, a space. And interestingly, I think, with people around us. So when we bring nature into spaces, it can not only improve our own well-being, but also that sense of community by creating these shared moments or contacts with nature. And I think that's really important, particularly over the last 18 months when we've been living at home, individually in our own little hermetically sealed boxes, connecting with people online. We've forgotten just how important connecting with people that moment is. And as we start to kind of come out of lockdown and we start to reconnect, that kind of wonderful feeling of being around people again. And, nature can be a great connector. It has creates those shared moments, those wonders of nature that facilitate a conversation. When you have a conversation, you might share an idea, a knowledge, a resource, and from that all sorts of amazing things can happen. We can start to innovate and get up and be better than who we once were.
In Tom Dixon's office in London, they've clad one of the spaces in cork, and the thing that strikes you when you walk in is the smell. You really think, oh my God, I'm in a forest, or I'm in a sort of really primitive environment. It's really powerful. But it's interesting what you were saying about peril, because nature isn't all lovely and calming. I mean, there are spiders, tarantulas, nasty things that want to bite you.
Which bit of Hackney do you live in exactly? It sounds a lot worse than when I lived in Hackney.
Well, but what I mean is that there's lots of things in nature that freak people out, like smelly things, scary things, just weird things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that idea of biophobia is remarkably strong. So many of us have never really seen tarantulas or experienced them. Certainly not in England, unless it's at a zoo or somebody owns one. But we have an innate reaction to them. Now, they've done some interesting tests where they show people different images of dangerous things. One image is of a gun, and people go, that's a gun. Another image is of a snake or a spider, and people recoil back. But of course, guns are far more deadly, kill far more people than snakes and spiders, even in England, let alone America or wherever. But we have a far greater instinctive reaction to that kind of biophobic element. And it just sort of indicates how powerful this connection, this inherited connection to nature is. So that is one negative element. But actually there are many positives that we've all experienced of being in nature and engaging with it and having that sense of wonder and awe of being around it. And biophilic design is really about drawing on those positive experiences and finding relevant, appropriate ways of bringing them into the built environment. And it is a very localized, vernacular form of design in a way, because essentially it's not about bringing a plant from a tropical country or using a foreign hardwood. It's about reconnecting with materials and colors and textures that reference one's own immediate experience of nature and creates a sense of identity.
But also to be in the natural world, because there are things that want to bite you or whatever, that does make you be more aware of your surroundings. And that was, I think, the peril things. Like, sometimes it's good to be a little bit scared. Sometimes it's good to be a little bit stressed, as long as you can then overcome it. So how do you work that into biophilic design then, that idea that it's, that there are things there that keep you alert almost? Well,
I mean, it's not just about having a calming, kind of zombifying effect on you. It is about creating similar experiences of nature. And there's an interesting book called The Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv that kind of discusses this idea that children have a nature deficit disorder. When I was growing up, I spent a lot of my childhood running through the woods, climbing trees, building camps, running through rivers. And increasingly, because of media and television and gaming systems, and because nature is seen as dangerous, and because we're quite simply not even allowed onto land anymore in the way we could once roam, children have become disconnected. But those kind of lessons that I learned are really important for people's kind of self-awareness and self-development and the ergonomics of life. So, in a way, this idea of peril is about creating those kind of exciting, stimulating moments with obvious kind of required levels of safety. So it might be about standing on a balcony with a glass balustrade, looking down over 3 or 4 floors and getting that sense of vertigo, knowing that you've got a 1.1 meter building regulation height handrail, but you get that sense of excitement. I mean, it could be about being on a hanging chair or kind of building a treehouse, or looking out over a space from a mezzanine level. There are a number of ways that we can create that excitement in the built environment without necessarily putting people in danger.
And I've personally rebuilt my relationship with wasps over the summer, because, like many people, if I ever saw a wasp, I'd be like, get away, got to kill it. But apparently, if you're more respectful to wasps, then they kind of respect you. And I was watching YouTube videos of people picking up wasps and letting them crawl all over their hands and putting them gently out the window. Yeah. And although I haven't gone quite that far in my relationship with wasps, I have started to be much more gentle to them and to appreciate that they're amazing. They pollinate, they eat bugs, they're really powerful friends. But something in our brains tells us that wasps are a nasty, scary thing. So we maybe need to retrain ourselves to love some of the less appealing aspects of nature.
Yes, I mean, I think that there's an inherent sort of colour scheme in a wasp that says danger, don't touch, and we see that across the natural world. And I think we do need to kind of reframe our relationship with nature, not necessarily see it as sort of dangerous or a negative, but actually look at the positives and the role that things like wasps and bees play in pollinating, delivering us food and becoming an essential part of our biodiversity, and welcoming them back into our cities. Because actually, when we welcome nature back into our cities, it has multiple benefits. We bring trees and greenery. It can reduce urban heat island effect. It can moderate flooding by kind of soaking up water and slowing down. It can bring humidity in. It can create, enhance and support biodiversity. That biodiversity can pollinate our food. So there are multiple physical benefits to cities and the spaces that we live in when we bring nature in. On top of that, of course, are all those psychological benefits that we have when we create spaces that are so clearly thriving, that when we create spaces filled with nature, it creates a diverse set of spaces where we immediately sense that actually, if nature can survive here, then so can we.
But don't you think that biophilic design should be a two-way deal? Like, humans benefit from having plants inside, but there's not much biodiversity in 5 yucca plants, is there? There's there's no insects, there's no microbes, it doesn't do much for biodiversity to have a few pot plants in the house. So how can we help nature at the same time as helping ourselves?
Well, I think this kind of word diversity is really important. We need to be creating diverse environments, and we see this in the landscape of modern workplace design. Is that we've moved away from having individual worker cells and secluded offices into open plan, into more agile forms of working, into now co-working spaces. And what we now tend to see when we walk into a successful co-working space is a diverse range of spaces. And it may be about, creating different places for people to sit and work quietly, different places where they can meet and talk, somewhere they can grab a coffee. It may be about a diversity of bits of furniture. So you have, proper chairs and desks, sit-stand desks, meeting tables, quiet booths. It may also be about a diversity of different forms of nature. And when we put plants and greenery into a space with our biophilic design strategies, it is always about how we implement that sense of diversity, both with spaces, furniture, but also the elements of nature. So that when people walk in, they immediately sense we have that kind of there's the quality of spaces that can support their physical, mental and emotional needs throughout the day. So diversity is important, not just in the natural world, but also in the physical world that we've built ourselves.
A couple more questions for me before we go to audience questions, and maybe it's time to get a little bit more serious. You talked about the kind of climate and biodiversity crisis. COP26 climate conference is coming up in Glasgow next month. We've all become very aware recently that the built environment is responsible for 40% of all carbon emissions. Half of those carbon emissions happen before the building opens through embodied carbon in the materials and the transportation and everything like that. What's happening in the design community? It seems like people are getting a bit more activist about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, can you imagine a point in the past where people are actually blocking motorways saying we want to put loft insulation in? I mean, this is, it's terrible, of course, for anybody that's stuck behind that, but amazing that we've got this level of passion and activism going on. And I think it's really important the design industry gets involved. We're seeing a rise in the declaration movement across the kind of building stakeholder construction sector. I'm actually a founding signatory of Interior Design Declares. So if there are any interior designers out there, then get involved, sign up to Interior Design Declares, because we need we need suppliers to get involved. And that's happening across all the different areas. There's an interior, construction declares, architects declares. It's essentially a pledge to saying, I'm committed, I'm going to make a change. It's not going to happen immediately, but I'm committed to doing something better. And we're seeing that across the industry. And essentially what it's asking people to do is kind of change the way they act, change the way they design, change the way they interact with their clients, but also importantly with the materials and the products that we're bringing into buildings, and making sure that we're asking difficult questions of our suppliers, making sure that they're clear, they're transparent, their materials are traceable, that the materials don't harm human well-being, that actually when the materials are used, they're durable, they're fixable, and that ultimately when they get taken out, they can go back to that supplier to be reused in a loop of circularity. So I think there is an enormous amount of work to do. I think the architectural world has been on top of this for some time because of building regulations and legislation. But the interior design industry is way behind. It's absolutely tragic, it's shocking, and it's embarrassing to be involved in the interiors industry and to see how badly they're performing, how they are lacking in environmental awareness. But actually remember, we spend 90% of our lives indoors. The spaces that we create have an enormous impact on our physical, mental well-being, but also the world outside our door. And I think it's high time the interior design industry get off their bum and do something about it, and recognize that the world that they inhabit, that they have an influence on, can make a difference to the wider environment.
And so interior designers declare, what exactly are you declaring, and what do signatories then have to do?
Well, basically, people are signing up to change the way they behave. So it is in part about making sure that knowledge and advice is put out, and making sure that information is open source. It's about changing your practices, making sure you're asking those difficult questions, making sure that the materials that you're putting into spaces come from a good source of provenance, that you're designing with a consciousness that they're going to be used, they're durable, they're fixable, and that ultimately at the end of their life they're going to go on somewhere else, so that you have that sense of circularity. And so it's a whole raft. It's about 15 different features. If you look at interiordesignedeclares.co.uk, you can see all the different features of it. And essentially, it's not mandatory. There's nobody policing it, but it is a commitment to say, I'm going to stand up and try and do something better. And we have to start somewhere. And I think, all of these construction declares, built environment declares movements are going to be getting together and going to COP26 with a mandate to say, look, we need to be doing better. And I think that's really important. We need to be represented because, as you say, 40% of our carbon emissions come from the construction and the built environment.
And how much influence and power do you think architects and designers have if you're trying to become an advocate and say to clients, well, look, you should use more sustainable materials, you should say to your supply chain, look, can you check this is sourced properly, you can check that it's recyclable or reusable or has a long life or whatever. How often do those clients and those suppliers say to you, yes, you're absolutely right, Oliver, we must do that? Or how often do they say, you know, we're going to go find another designer who's not so asking such difficult questions of us? How persuadable is the rest of the supply chain?
It's a difficult transitional period. You know, it's not going to be easy. We're going to be asking difficult questions. But what we're seeing more and more of is that you can get away with that for a short amount of time. But when their employees realise that they've created a physically toxic environment for people to work in, when they realise that they don't care about the environment, what we're going to be seeing is people leaving those organisations because they don't share values. So yes, they'll get away with it, and maybe for 5 years they can do that. But it's not a sustainable option. It's not going to be perpetuating, and those people will be left behind. And we're seeing more and more accreditation systems helping people in buildings understand that spaces have been designed to have a commitment to the environment and a commitment to human well-being. So of course we've got the likes of BREEAM and LEED that are kind of supporting the sustainable development in the built environment, but also the likes of Fitwell, the Living Building Challenge and the Well Building Standard that are kind of championing this idea of health and well-being in the built environment. So we're seeing this kind of dual approach towards a carbon and human-centred kind of development of buildings moving forwards and getting ever greater recognition and being picked up more and more. So I think, you know, we're in a transitional period, and that's fine if they want to go somewhere else, because I don't want to be involved in a project that's going to have a detrimental impact on the environment and people's lives.
And we're starting to see suppliers, furniture brands, design brands, flooring brands, put their heads above the parapet and say, we're going for net zero, or we're only using these kind of materials. Big up the good guys. Who's doing good work in
So
in
this
the sector?
is amazing. This is really exciting. I'm a founding member of a new exhibition called Planted. It was on last weekend at King's Cross, and we are championing the idea that we want to connect people with spaces and nature. And we're working with all sorts of kind of fantastic exhibitors. So a few of them are people like Vestra, who are kind of the Scandinavian outdoor furniture brand, who are just building a sort of fantastic sustainable factory in the middle of the woods. We've been working with the likes of Biotecture, create kind of game-changing green walls that purify air. Benchmark are doing really interesting things at the moment. So all their products have an environmental product declaration label. So it's not necessarily saying, you know, our products are brilliant for the environment, although they are, but it's just saying, look, we're transparent. This is the impact of this chair against this one. So you can literally measure the impact a chair with a leather seat pad has against one with a timber seat pad, and actually the carbon footprint of that. As well as that, they'll fix your furniture if it breaks. They'll also buy your furniture back at the end of its life. So they're taking responsibility for the materials, and that's something that more and more organizations are doing. So companies like Interface, who are the flooring brand, are kind of at these very ambitious goals to be carbon negative, and then starting to think about being carbon positive as well, locking carbon into the backings of carpet tiles, locking carbon away in a product, much like timber might lock carbon away. They're also creating surfaces that are biomimetics, that have that kind of biophilic quality and create very naturalized environments. So there are some really interesting companies taking this idea of well-being for both planet and people ahead to create kind of healthier spaces. And I think, for me, that's really exciting.
Okay, I'm going to go over to the audience questions now, because before we run out of time.
Great.
And actually the first question is very much along the lines of what we've been talking about. So Sarah Khan asks, how can materiality and biophilic design help contribute to buildings achieving sustainability credentials / targets, e.g. net zero? Well, let's talk about the carbon side of things. What's the connection between biophilic design, which is about making humans feel better in the interior space, and a concept like net zero, which is to say this project is not going to contribute anything to atmospheric CO2?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a sort of a really important link. Now, if you imagine that the most efficient building essentially is a kind of, let's say, rectangular box, super insulated walls covered in solar panels with a door going in. And you walk inside that box and it's just black, like this background. So then at some point you've got to start to introduce some elements that will support human life and human activity in that building for it to be a successful building. Because essentially if we don't create spaces that support functionality in spaces and human well-being, then they fall behind very quickly. And to take just a carbon-centered approach to a building means that the people who work in that space won't have any quality of life, they won't have any connection to nature, natural light. They'll very quickly realise that actually once they've got a new building, that kind of honeymoon period of moving into a new space wears off very quickly when they realise they don't have any connection, that it doesn't support their well-being or the intended activity of the space. So essentially, to just take carbon-centered approach will not support human well-being in a building. And we need that human well-being. We need this dual approach of carbon and human-centered design to create truly kind of successful regenerative spaces, regenerative for both people and planet.
And Elliot asks, because we've got time for one more audience question, can the core... Oh, hang on, there was a different question there just now. There's three. Okay, well, I'm going to ask both of them. Elliot asks, can the core principles of biophilic design be expanded to include appropriate wildlife, such as cat cafes or birds and fish, for example? But also what I was talking about, like, can you introduce biodiversity into a building rather than just plants?
Yes, absolutely. There are multiple studies to show that when pets are allowed into offices, particularly dogs, then they have a very unifying effect. But it's not necessarily just about the interior of the buildings. We've got to think about the wider biodiversity that a building can support. What we're seeing in the likes of Singapore are buildings literally covered in green walls that support biodiversity. They support habitats for squirrels, rodents, bees, insects,
Wasps.
birds.
Wasps?
Probably the odd wasp or two, maybe bees. And so we're literally creating habitats. More and more countries across the world, in Paris and also Scandinavia, are creating rooftops that can support biodiversity, so green roofs. So yes, absolutely, it's not just necessarily the soft, fluffy bits of nature that we bring into buildings. It's how the external landscape, whether that's the building's facades, the roofs, or the spaces in between, can support well-being. Well, I mean, one of the best things that you can actually do is introduce an area of water. When you introduce water, you introduce the opportunity for all different forms of life, fauna and flora, to have somewhere to root to, to get sort of water for drinking and hydration, to support other forms of life. So it's kind of bringing bodies of water in and supporting that is kind of fundamental to the rewilding of our cities.
Presumably that's outside, though. You don't want a watering hole inside the...
No, actually, bringing water in is really important. We did this beautiful scheme once where it was just a really small space, but we put these two water walls in. And the water cascaded down. And what the effect was actually you could see the patterns of water kind of cascading down and the light kind of filtering through it. It introduced the sound of water, which is very good for masking distracting noise, particularly speech. But it also dramatically changed the humidity of the space. So whilst a lot of the other spaces were very dry, as soon as you walked into this space, it sounded different, it felt different, it looked very different. So if you can contain water, it has an enormous benefit to interior spaces.
And final question, this is one I was looking for before. Janet asks, how do you begin your design process when you are creating a new space that facilitates a connection to nature? So I guess back to you, and how do you do it? So client says, great, give us some biophilic design. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is we would assess the opportunities that exist. When you kind of approach the building, what are those areas that we can start to connect to nature? So it may be that there are particular routes in the area that you can create walking meeting routes, but perhaps there's areas where you can just sit, where people can kind of surround themselves in nature for a couple of minutes to act as a buffer zone before people walk in. Or maybe, the space that you're designing is on the 15th floor of a building and you're looking out. So it's about looking at maybe the views going out or the natural light flooding in. So initially it's about assessing all those different biophilic attributes that you already have immediately available. And then what's fundamental is this human connection and doing what we call pre and post occupancy evaluations, creating your own data. As I mentioned, there are all these studies that demonstrate the benefits of bringing nature into spaces, but of course all of those studies just pique people's interest. These are studies that happened at another time in another place for another organisation, and what's really important is that we continue that learning, continue the development of that knowledge with pre-occupancy evaluations and asking the staff who are going to occupy that space, how do you feel in your current office or your existing space? And are you being productive? How are you being supported? And getting some feedback from that. All too often, our knowledge just comes from one person who says, we need 15 desks and this and this. but there's no research. You know, and if you think about it, you know, without research, you're just another person with an opinion. So what's fundamental is that we do gather these larger bodies of information. We base our briefs on that, and then find ways of reacting to the briefs created by these pre-occupancy evaluations from that knowledge, and then start to create these proliferations of spaces and bring elements of nature in to support those particular activities. And it could be the real forms of nature, or it could be colours and materials and textures, or simply somewhere to sit and recuperate. And creating this kind of diverse kind of habitat of spaces and connections to nature. And essentially, once we've created that space and people have reoccupied it, carry out a post-occupancy evaluation and go like, well, did we get it right? What did we hit? What did we miss? What could we improve on? And keep that knowledge base going.
Oliver, it's been great to speak to you. You did shame us a little bit when you first walked into our studio and pointed out there are no plants in here. I promise you there will be plants in the studio
in the background.
Next time.
A couple of ferns at least.
I'm not sure we want ferns in shot, but definitely over there, I think towards the window where all of our in-house, in-studio audience are sitting would be definitely improved with some
next time,
plants.
Marcus, next time.
And next time you come back, they will be there. Thank you very much, Oliver. Thank you very much, CDUK, for making this talk possible. And thank you very much to our audience, and particularly for the people who asked the questions.
Thank you.